Matthew shows Jesus is king. His focus is on who Jesus is. The key here is fulfillment. It was written to Jewish believers. Matthew's story of Jesus is easily dividable into 5 parts with a prologue and an epilogue. Each of the 5 parts alternates between teaching and narrative. So like Jesus gives a long teaching, and then the book says, after he had finished saying these things, then there's a section of narrative providing what was said, then a section of narrative proving what was said, fulfilling the Old Testament and carrying the story forward. So here are the sections. Remember, the key to understanding Matthew is that he was strengthening the knowledge and faith of his believing Jewish friends by explaining how Jesus satisfied the entire Old Testament. There are 68 references to the Old Testament in Matthew, and 23 times Jesus clearly fulfills a prophecy. That's a lot. So in light of these 2 narrative elements, a really long, wonderful book becomes much more manageable to study. So the book starts with an intro section that begins with a genealogy as part of the preparation for the king. Genealogies. Some of the most mocked portions of the Bible with their begats and their jokes. I have to say that if you read the Bible as narrative like it was intended, this section would really matter to you. Remember, God promised Abraham that the whole world would be blessed through him. So for the story to make any sense, Jesus has to be Abraham's descendant, which he is, which is what the genealogy is about. Okay, he can't just be a random guy, guys. And he's not. And so we see Jesus' lineage traced from Abraham through Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Boaz and Ruth, David and Bathsheba, Solomon, Rehoboam, Hezekiah, Uzziah, lots of kings, Zerubbabel, Joseph, and Mary. Here we go, the promised baby. But the genealogy starts first with Jesus being the son of David. And this is one of Matthew's purposes, to help these Jewish believers see exactly how Jesus is the promised Messiah, the son of David. And with the story of that baby's birth, wise men, visits from angels, an evil leader murdering children to keep power, a trip to Egypt, and a return to Nazareth. John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus as a prophet. And in that section, 6 Old Testament fulfillments. Then we get into the first of the 5 sections that I was talking about before. So in section 1, Moses went up on the mountain to bring the law. Jesus goes up on the mountain to bring love. He preaches the greatest sermon of all time, the Sermon on the Mount. There's clear teaching about salt and light. There's just iconic phrase after iconic phrase. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Don't lay up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy. Don't be anxious about anything. Judge not, lest you be judged. Plus, in the sermon, we get the key verse in Matthew, chapter 5, verse 17. Jesus said, don't say I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Fulfill. There's our key word. Speaking of fulfillment, there's one more here as the first of 5 sections finishes amidst the calming of a storm, the healing of men with demons, and a paralytic, and much more. Here it is, fulfillment 7. Then there's section 2, chapters 10 through 12. This is the shortest of the 5. Jesus sends out the apostles on a ministry mission, and John the Baptist asks who Jesus is through a messenger from prison, and there's more teaching on the kingdom. Plus, some more fulfillments. Are you getting like the flow of it? This is really the key to Matthew, to understanding it. And that goes right into section 3, chapters 13 through 17, with parables of seeds, weeds, leaven, treasure, a pearl, fish, and an explanation on why parables exist. And why is all this stuff there? Of course, to fulfill something. Then we get the finality of the John the Baptist story. Spoiler, he dies a gruesome death. Jesus walks on water, he heals, he teaches, he feeds 4,000 with just some bread and fish. There's a lot of increasing beef with the Pharisees and Sadducees almost constantly. Peter identifies Jesus as the Christ. Jesus is transfigured, and also he starts telling his disciples that he would soon be killed. Plus, more fulfillment. And then section 4, Jesus teaches here about true greatness, temptation, personal behavioral ethics of his followers, divorce, parables of lost sheep, a parable of an unforgiving servant, and workers in God's vineyard. And then the narrative section, the repetitive foretelling of his death. Jesus heals blind men, he victoriously enters Jerusalem, he cleanses the temple, he curses a fig tree, and the beef with him and the Pharisees reaches really new heights. He also tells more parables about 2 sons, about tenants in a vineyard, and these are directly against the Pharisees, and they know it. The Pharisees ask him a question, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, Deuteronomy 6:5, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Then Jesus intellectually annihilates the Pharisees by unleashing the theological bomb of Psalm 110 verse 1 about the Messiah who's both David's Lord and divine son, and their minds literally explode. The Pharisees' narrative continues into the final section of discourse as Jesus completely demolishes his enemies in front of them. And then section 5, chapter 23 is 7 woes on the Pharisees and scribes. Jesus just absolutely absolutely destroys them for their evil hearts, which goes into Jesus' end times prophecies in chapter 24 and his parables of the end times in chapter 25. It's like Jesus' own miniature book of prophecy right here near the end. And that ends the discourse sections in Matthew. All that's left is the horrific climax of the story. Jesus is anointed by a woman, and he says that she's preparing his body for burial. Greedy Judas, who's annoyed by the expense of the action, betrays Jesus. Jesus is having Passover with his disciples, and he institutes the Lord's Supper that we still take at church today. He prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he's betrayed, arrested, and fulfills 2 more prophecies. He gets tried multiple times. He gets beaten, whipped, tortured, and evil murderers chosen to be released from prison over him by the Jews. And then he gets nailed to a Roman torture device, a wooden cross designed to kill you by painful asphyxiation. And while all of these horrific things are happening, he's fulfilling more and more and more prophecies. They're killing the person they've been waiting for so long. And then Jesus died. The curtain in the Holy of Holies was torn from top to bottom. The whole world goes dark, and some dead people start crawling out of their graves. A Roman centurion said what the Jewish people had missed: surely this man was the Son of God. But the story isn't over. Jesus was buried on the Friday of Passover, but on Sunday, he defeated death once and for all in his greatest act, gaining life again. The Pharisees, his enemies, paid the Roman guards to say that the disciples had stolen his body, but they couldn't stop him anymore. Well, they never really could. And the believers knew the truth. Death couldn't defeat this God-man, the God-man we'd been promised since the beginning, the seed of Eve, the promised son of Abraham and David, the fulfillment of the law of Moses by his own love, the inaugurator and sealer of Jeremiah's new covenant, Jesus Christ. He leaves his disciples with a new command called the Great Commission, to go into all the world and make disciples by teaching them and baptizing him in his name and with his power and presence.